Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly trippy world of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry, the civilization that gave us pyramids, mummies, and apparently festivals that could rival your college roommate's worst decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the ancient Egyptians' most famous botanical party trick, the blue lotus flower. You've probably seen it in tomb paintings, those elegant petals usually being sniffed by pharaohs or gently waved around at banquets like an ancient version of a toast. But this flower wasn't just ornamental. The Egyptians believed it had sacred properties, and yes, mild psychoactive ones. Modern research has actually identified the two main compounds in the blue lotus, apomorphine and luciferin. Apomorphine is an alkaloid that interacts with dopamine receptors, and it's even used in modern medicine to treat things like Parkinson's disease. Luciferin, on the other hand, is a dopamine receptor blocker. The combination creates a soft, dreamy euphoria, not enough to make you forget your name, but enough to make the idea of building a massive pyramid in the hot sun sound like a fun group project. The method was simple. They'd take the dried petals and soak them in wine for a while, sometimes for days, before drinking the infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or presumably whenever they felt like tuning out the sound of 200 people chanting hymns at top volume. To be clear, the Egyptians didn't call this getting high, they called it communing with the gods. The blue lotus was strongly associated with rebirth and the sun god Ra, which made it perfect for temple rituals and funerary rites. Holding the flower to one's nose was a symbolic way of inhaling divinity. And, maybe also a great way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling the Nile Valley. It was everywhere in their art. Pharaohs are shown holding it. Party guests at banquets are passing it around like a floral peace pipe, and even mummies were decorated with it for the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're traveling to eternity, let's make sure we're stocked up. Practical. For the ancient Egyptians floating under the stars, sipping lotus wine, and feeling as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze was spiritual fulfillment, and also a very good night. And then there's the Feast of Drunkenness. The name is subtle, I know. This annual celebration revolved around the goddess Hathor, who, according to the myth, was once sent to punish humanity. After a bloody spree, the gods decided humanity had maybe learned its lesson. So they tricked her into drinking 7,000 jars of red beer that looked just like the blood of her victims. She passed out, woke up in a better mood, and just like that, mass extinction was narrowly avoided through a heroic hangover. To commemorate this moment, Egyptians gathered once a year to get thoroughly obliterated. Not metaphorically, but literally. The goal was to drink until one entered a divine trance, which sounds poetic until you remember this often meant collapsing face first into a mud brick courtyard, surrounded by strangers yelling praises between hiccups. The ritual began at dawn with music and clapping, and priests encouraged revelers to drink as much as your heart desires, which in this context was less of a blessing and more of a dare. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. The idea was to honor the balance between destruction and joy, reminding everyone that even wrathful deities could be pacified with a strong enough brew. It was theology meets a keg stand. And importantly, this was sanctioned behavior. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Participants purged their fears, inhibitions, and likely their stomach contents all in one divinely authorized party. The next day brought headaches and regret, but also spiritual cleansing. And what was the star of this show? Beer. But forget everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything remotely resembling a beverage you'd order at a bar. It was thick, porridge-like, and alarmingly opaque, served with a consistency that would confuse both your bartender and your dentist. Beer for the Egyptians was not just a social drink, it was practically a food group, made from partially baked loaves of emmer bread that were soaked in water, mashed, and fermented into a chunky slurry. It resembled a soupy oatmeal more than a refreshing ale. The technical term might be liquid bread, and this stuff was consumed by everyone: peasants, priests, children, scribes, and anyone else trying to survive in a world where desert heat, crocodiles, and public works projects were daily concerns. It was calorically dense, slightly intoxicating, and often intentionally altered with herbs and spices for festivals or ceremonies. This wasn't a small-scale operation either. At Abydos, archaeologists discovered the world's oldest industrial-scale brewery, dating back 5,000 years, with the capacity to produce up to 22,000 litres of beer per batch. Think about that. A single batch was the size of a modern-day swimming pool, and it was likely used for royal funerary cults and to pay labourers. Workers on state projects like pyramid building were often paid in beer, receiving a daily ration of several litres. This means that half of ancient Egyptian labour was fueled by liquid gluten and mild intoxication. Beyond beer, the ancient Egyptians had a whole apothecary of substances. Let's talk about kyphi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering if they were actually meditating or just very, very light-headed. Kyphi wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. The recipes varied by temple, with some having over 50 ingredients. Ingredients often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, and juniper. They would mix it all up, let it ferment, dry it into pellets, and burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. Visions weren't just encouraged, they were practically inevitable. Whether it was divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. Even in death, kyphi lingered. It was burned during mummification, buried in tombs, and probably responsible for at least one pharaoh being accidentally embalmed in a spice rub. In short, kyphi was Egypt's way of saying, if you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. If blue lotus was Egypt's chill friend, and kyphi was the drama queen with a smoke machine, then mandrake was the slightly unhinged guest you invited once and immediately regretted. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans, mandrake was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare. Used in ancient Egyptian medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, mandrake earned its place in temple recipes and medical scrolls with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for wild animals. It contained alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine, the kind of compounds that mess with your nervous system and can occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones, welcome to night terrors, starring Ra and a crocodile in a wig. And then there's a quiet little mention of shemet. That's right, cannabis. Because when it came to pain relief, the ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention. Sometimes they reached for something a little more herbal. Cannabis appears in medical texts like the Ibis Papyrus mostly as a treatment for inflammation, sore eyes, and various gynecological complaints. Yes, gynecological. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like a modern wellness trend someone is definitely going to try to resurrect on Etsy. Officially, it wasn't recreational. Unofficially, well, when you're running a civilization in 120-degree heat with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem, no one blames you for accidentally over-medicating. This isn't just theory. Residue analysis from mummies and burial sites has turned up trace amounts of cannabis, along with opium and nicotine, which raises either some fascinating pharmacological questions or the world's most suspicious funeral offerings. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. If something brought them closer to the gods in life, Even if it was a psychoactive flower soaked in wine or a ceremonial incense, it belonged in the tomb along with their amulets and linen headrests. And while the pharaohs wore the crowns, it was the priests who had the keys to the sacred stash. They weren't just spiritual guides, they were state-sanctioned pharmacists, supplying the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown psychedelic experiences disguised as Holy Communion. This gave them an enormous amount of soft power. You didn't ask, "What's going on with the harvest?" You asked, "What did the high priest see in his trance last night?" Now, this wasn't all just available to anyone. While commoners got their thick barley beer and maybe a whiff of temple incense, the elite were bathing in blue lotus oil and sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. The more potent substances, like mandrake, kyphi blends laced with opium, or imported cannabis resins, were likely restricted to ritual or medical use, which, funny enough, just happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules of court officials and high priests. Even in death, the elite kept their stash close. Tums contain medicinal vials, incense cones, and wine jars with labels so vague they may as well have read, "For ceremonial purposes only." One wonders if the gods actually required that much imported poppy resin, or if King Tut just liked to keep his options open. All of this tells us one clear thing: humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't so different from us, really. They just wore more eyeliner and took their hallucinations a whole lot more seriously. Let's start our deep dive into the surprisingly trippy world of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry with the most famous botanical party trick of them all, the blue lotus flower. You've probably seen it in tomb paintings, those elegant petals usually being sniffed by pharaohs or gently waved around at banquets. For a long time, historians just figured it was an ornamental flower, something to make the tombs and temples look pretty, and maybe it was. But that was only part of the story, because the Egyptians themselves believed it had sacred properties, and, as it turns out, mild psychoactive ones. Yes, the blue lotus could get you just a little bit floaty. The method was pretty simple. They'd take the dried petals and soak them in wine for a while, sometimes for days. Then, they would drink the infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or presumably, whenever they felt like tuning out the sound of 200 people chanting hymns at top volume. The result wasn't a mind-bending trip that would make you forget your name. Instead, it was a soft, dreamy euphoria. You would feel as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze, and suddenly, the idea of helping to build a massive pyramid in the hot sun sounded like a fun group project. And what's wild is that modern science has actually confirmed this. Researchers have identified the two main psychoactive compounds in the blue lotus as apomorphine and nuciferin. The first, apomorphine, is an alkaloid that interacts with your brain's dopamine receptors. In fact, it's used in modern medicine to help treat things like Parkinson's disease. The second compound, nuciferin, is a dopamine receptor blocker. So you have a 1-2 punch of a compound that gives you a little lift, and one that blocks some of the other signals, creating that gentle, dreamy state the Egyptians prized so much. In a strange twist of fate, the US Department of Defense has actually banned blue lotus because of its psychoactive properties, which just goes to show that what was once a sacred, ancient ritual substance is still potent enough to be taken seriously today. But the Egyptians didn't call this getting high or taking a trip. They called it communing with the gods. The blue lotus was strongly associated with rebirth and the sun god Ra, which made it perfect for temple rituals and funerary rites. When you see a pharaoh or a banquet guest holding the flower to their nose in a painting, they're not just admiring its scent, they're symbolically inhaling divinity. It was a way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling the Nile Valley. Sure, but it was so much more than that. This flower was a tool for spiritual transcendence. It was so important to them that it was everywhere in their art. Pharaohs are shown holding it, Party guests at banquets are passing it around like a floral peace pipe, and even mummies were decorated with it for the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're traveling to eternity, let's make sure we're stocked up. Practical. For the ancient Egyptians, that beautiful, tranquil state was spiritual fulfillment, and also a very, very good night. And you can just imagine what those festivals were like. The Blue Lotus wasn't just for ceremonial moments in a hushed temple, it was for the big parties too. Festivals could get wild, and Blue Lotus-infused wine made the music louder, the dancing looser, and the hieroglyphic poetry marginally more profound. Just imagine a crowd under the stars, sipping that lotus wine and feeling as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze. For them, it was a way to experience the divine right here on earth, without having to wait for the afterlife. And that brings us to their religious holidays, and then there's the Feast of Drunkenness, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of saying, let's black out in honor of not dying. Subtle name. No, accurate. Extremely. This annual celebration wasn't a gentle lotus buzz. It was a full-on glorious, divinely sanctioned party designed to get you completely obliterated. The myth behind it is the perfect explanation for why they would do something so extreme. It all revolved around the goddess Hathor, who, according to a myth known as the Book of the Heavenly Cow, was once sent to punish humanity. After a bloody spree that would make any disaster movie blush, the gods decided humanity had maybe learned its lesson. So, to stop her rampage, they tricked her into drinking thousands of jars of red beer that looked just like the blood of her victims. She passed out, woke up in a better mood, and just like that, mass extinction was narrowly avoided through alcohol poisoning. To commemorate this heroic hangover, the Egyptians gathered once a year to celebrate. The goal was to drink until one entered a divine trance, which sounds incredibly poetic until you remember this often meant collapsing face first into a mud brick courtyard, surrounded by strangers yelling praises between hiccups. The ritual began at dawn with music, clapping, and the ceremonial passing of drinks. Priests encouraged revelers to drink as much as your heart desires, which in this context was less of a blessing and more of a dare. Participants banged tambourines, danced in the streets, and reportedly saw the goddess, though whether that was Hathor or just the side of a clay jug is unclear. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. The idea was to honor the balance between destruction and joy, reminding everyone that even wrathful deities could be pacified with a strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets keg stand. And importantly, this was sanctioned behavior. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was literally part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Komotep? Do you hate the gods? Modern scholars have described the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal, a moment when participants purged their fears, inhibitions, and likely their stomach contents, all in one divinely authorized party. The next day brought headaches, regret, possibly a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also spiritual cleansing. Forget everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything remotely resembling a beverage you'd order at a bar today. This was a thick, porridge-like, and alarmingly opaque fluid. It was served with the kind of consistency that would confuse both your bartender and your dentist. Beer for the Egyptians was not just a social drink, it was practically a food group. Made from partially baked loaves of emmer bread that were soaked in water, mashed, and fermented into a chunky slurry, it resembled a soupy oatmeal more than a refreshing ale. It was, for all intents and purposes, a bowl of carbs in denial. But let's be honest, modern brewers would probably call it a war crime. The final product was cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine oatmeal that had opinions and a mild buzz. And this wasn't just some niche beverage. This was the drink of the people. Everyone drank it: pharaohs, priests, peasants, even toddlers. Why? Because when the water from the Nile could kill you, and milk was suspicious at best, beer was the least deadly option with a pleasant side effect. It was calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating, and often served in communal jugs, because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from a pot of soggy bread water. At temples and festivals, the beer might even be enhanced with herbs, dates, honey, or other mystery ingredients that were either sacred or just experimental. The Egyptians were so committed to this concoction that they even invented straws with filters to catch the bigger bread chunks. There was no foam, no carbonation, no glass bottles, just a national commitment to ignoring mouthfeel. This beer wasn't just for sustenance. It was often intentionally altered with other curious additives. Want to commune with the gods? Add some mandrake. Want to forget the priest's speech about cosmic order? Toss in a little fermented date juice and hope for the best. But most importantly, it was a form of payment. Pyramid workers didn't clock out with coins. They received a daily beer ration, sometimes several liters per day. This means that the guys hauling limestone blocks all morning were doing it buzzed and breaded, and somehow the pyramids still got built. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in hand. To the ancient Egyptians, a lukewarm jar of beer porridge was Michelin star cuisine. Now that you've washed down your bread beer with a floral buzz, it's time to set the mood with some smoke. But not just any smoke. We're talking kyphi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering if they were actually meditating or just very, very lightheaded. Kyphi wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. Recipes varied by temple, but the ingredients often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper, and whatever other spices were lying around not being sacrificed. You would mix it all up, let it ferment, dry it into pellets, and burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. It was used in ritual purification, which is code for, let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase our sins, or at least our memories of last night's feast of drunkenness. And here's the kicker: temples didn't have ventilation. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a limestone cube next to a sweating priest waving a smoking dish of kyphi like it's a breath for the soul, while a chant drones in a monotone behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged, they were practically inevitable. Whether it was divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. If blue lotus was Egypt's chill friend, and kyphi was the drama queen with a smoke machine, then mandrake was the slightly unhinged guest you invited once and immediately regretted, with its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans and a reputation that scared even seasoned priests. Mandrake was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare, used in ancient Egyptian medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is always a terrifying combination. Mandrake earned its place in temple recipes and medical scrolls with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for wild animals and pharaohs in a bad mood. See, mandrake contains alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine. These are the kind of compounds that mess with your nervous system and occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones, welcome to night terrors, starring Rye and a crocodile in a wig. According to later folklore, pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to scream loudly and lethally. So naturally, the solution was to tie it to a dog, cover your ears, and let the poor creature yank it free while you hoped your neighbors didn't ask too many questions. It wasn't an everyday herb. Mandrake was for priests, magicians, and those who didn't mind taking medical advice from a man covered in gold leaf. Used recklessly, you'd wake up 4 days later convinced you were a scarab beetle. Somewhere in the vast scrolls of Egyptian medical wisdom, wedged between cures for crocodile bites and the proper placement of amulets on inflamed body parts, lies a quiet little mention of shemet. That's right, cannabis. Because when it came to pain relief, the ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention. Sometimes they reached for something a little more herbal. Cannabis appears in medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus and Ramesseum Papyrus mostly as a treatment for inflammation, sore eyes, and various gynecological complaints. Yes, gynecological. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like a modern wellness trend someone is definitely going to try to resurrect on Etsy. Cannabis was usually crushed into oils, mixed into salves, or blended with honey. Because if you're going to medicate, why not make it taste nice? Applied topically, it soothed pain. Inhaled accidentally, well, now the temple incense makes a lot more sense. Officially, it wasn't recreational. Unofficially, probably. When you're running a civilization in 120-degree heat with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem, no one blames you for accidentally over-medicating. There's also physical evidence. Residue analysis from mummies and burial sites has turned up trace amounts of cannabis, along with opium and nicotine, which raises either some fascinating pharmacological questions or the world's most suspicious funeral offerings. And let's not forget the opium stash. Small wrinkled poppy pods were imported from the Eastern Mediterranean, tucked away like a divine secret. Because when you've got plague, pain, and pyramid-related back injuries, sometimes prayer alone doesn't cut it. Though not native to Egypt, opium poppies likely made their debut through trade with Cyprus or Crete. By the time of the New Kingdom, poppies were well on their way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative, a medical miracle wrapped in mild addiction. Opium didn't just dull pain, it smoothed over childbirth, calmed coughs, and soothed gastrointestinal rage. Administered in drinks, pills, or occasionally as suppositories, it became the pharmaceutical equivalent of saying, "Shh, don't worry about it." The ancient texts don't call it opium directly, of course. That would be too helpful. They reference extracts from the poppy plant in the same vague way modern labels say, natural flavors, which is never comforting. For elite Egyptians, especially those being embalmed, opium might have been part of the final send-off. What better way to face the underworld than totally blissed out and blissfully unaware of the scarab beetle crawling across your nose? All of this tells us one very clear thing. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. If something brought them closer to the gods in life, even if it was a psychoactive flower soaked in wine, it belonged in the tomb along with your amulets, your Lenin headdress, and possibly a starter pack of dreams. They were brilliant at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single belief system. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same flower. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a sistrum and the smell of something smouldering that definitely wasn't FDA approved. The priests, as the state-sanctioned pharmacists, had enormous amounts of power. They supplied the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown psychedelic experiences disguised as Holy Communion. And while pharaohs wore the crowns, it was the priests who knew how to blend mandrake with wine and not kill anyone. The question of who ruled Egypt was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. It was a well-oiled machine, one that ran on faith, herbs, and occasionally mind-altering doses of divine inspiration. Now, let's jump forward a couple thousand years and a few thousand miles from the deserts of Egypt, past the mummies and the mystic ceremonies. Let's set the scene in Florence, Italy, in the late 1400s. The air was thick with incense, sweat, and the perfume of crushed roses. The city was bursting with art, with intellect, and with political intrigue, but also with a very specific kind of madness, the obsession with beauty, and not just any beauty. We're talking about Renaissance beauty, the kind that meant looking like a porcelain statue, even if it killed you. Enter Sirius, a luxurious, silky white face paint made from, you guessed it, lead. Yes, actual lead. Women across Florence, Venice, and beyond would smear this shimmering poison across their cheeks, foreheads, and décolletage to achieve that ultra-pale, ethereal look. Because in a world where tan skin meant you were a peasant laboring under the sun, looking like a walking cadaver was the ultimate flex. But this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. Oh no. Ceruse was layered on like Venetian stucco. Some women went so far as to sleep in it, refusing to wash their faces and allowing the toxic compound to literally soak into their skin. The result? A radiant, ghostly glow right up until the sores appeared. And when they did, they just applied more lead to cover them, like a Renaissance band-aid that was guaranteed to make the wound never heal. If the lead didn't get you, the mercury might. Used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots, mercury was another charming element in the Renaissance beauty arsenal. Combine that with arsenic-based tonics and vinegar face baths, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine that was marketed as elegance. Looking divine came at a divine cost, literally. These noble women wanted their skin to look untouched by sunlight or hardship, so the paler the better. This wasn't just about beauty, it was a deeply ingrained form of classism baked into every powdered pore. The ironic part is that the women who could afford all this toxic luxury also had access to imported perfumes from the Orient, rose water, and camphor-laced tonics. They literally smelled like angels while their skin was peeling off in sheets. This dangerous obsession with a certain aesthetic led to a whole host of terrifying medical consequences. The May Clinic today lists the symptoms of lead poisoning as everything from high blood pressure to abdominal pain, irritability, headaches, and even miscarriages in pregnant women. So, that ethereal, angelic look was often a mask for a woman who was in agony, both inside and out. The skin damage, the hair loss, the neurological problems. They were a hidden price for a very public display of status. And if you had a functioning pair of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the never-ending quest to resemble a painted statue or a particularly fashionable egg, Renaissance women plucked their hairlines and eyebrows into oblivion. A high, rounded forehead was considered the epitome of beauty. The higher your forehead, the more noble and intelligent you appeared. So, women willingly yanked out rows of hair from their brows and along their hairline with tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells. This wasn't a one-time affair, it was routine maintenance, a weekly ritual of pain and precision. For stubborn hairs, women rubbed in concoctions made from walnut oil or, wait for it, cat dung to thin the regrowth. Some even scorched stray hairs off with candle flames, because nothing says grace and refinement like lighting your face on fire. Eyebrows were thin, arched, and barely visible, if at all. A truly sophisticated woman had no visible brows. Instead, a soft shadow or trace was painted in later, often with burned cork or powdered charcoal, which sounds elegant until you realize it smeared terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly dripping down your cheeks during Mass. Divine. Meanwhile, body hair was seen as animalistic and unclean. Women removed it with a paste made from vinegar, quicklime, and arsenic, another charming blend. The mixture burned, but hey, it left the skin smooth, until it didn't, and the hair on the scalp. That was gathered up into tight, rigid styles, often braided and padded with false hair made from wool, horsehair, or someone else's actual hair. Sometimes hair pieces were soaked in lye and bleach to match the fashionable golden hue of the season. The irony in all this, a lot of it was done without mirrors. That's right, mirrors were rare and expensive. Most women styled themselves by feel, with help from their servants. Your maid better have had steady hands and zero passive aggression, because one wrong move, and your elegant widow's peak became a monastic tonsure. Renaissance beauty was less about natural charm and more about strategic subtraction. Remove the brows, remove the hairline, and in the process, remove common sense, all in the name of elegance. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked, and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. Specifically, squeezing it into shapes the human ribcage had no business aspiring to. Enter the Renaissance corset, equal parts fashion statement and orthopedic trauma. Renaissance corsets weren't quite the wasp-waisted death traps of later centuries, but they still meant business. Known as stays or bodies, these early versions were designed to flatten the torso, not cinch it. The goal was to create a smooth, rigid canvas that emphasized the bust and elongated the silhouette. Because what's sexier than looking like a very elegant plank? The stiffening materials were whalebone if you were rich, and reeds or pasterboard if you weren't. All of it was sewn into linen and laced tightly across the back. Getting into one required assistance, determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing peripheral vision. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armored artichoke, layered, spiked, and strangely delicate. And corsets weren't just about looks, they were moral statements. A straight, upright posture indicated inner virtue. Slouching, on the other hand, suggested moral laxity and possibly demonic possession. So, if you were a well-bred lady, you stood straight, walked stiffly, and breathed in short, shallow gasps. Bonus points if you fainted gracefully in public. That just meant you were doing it right. Underneath, linen chemises helped absorb sweat, because newsflash, Florence in summer was not a place for heavy fabrics and no airflow. But elegance came first, comfort came never. And yet, despite the discomfort, corsets had a very important purpose. They held everything in place. The Royal College of Surgeons even has a deformed rib cage on display from the era, a tragic testament to the long-term effects of this beauty standard. Doctors noted conditions like chlorosis or green sickness, which was a form of anemia caused by restricted breathing and poor digestion. These corsets may have made you look divine, but they were slowly crushing your internal organs. This created a very difficult paradox when it came to feasting. On the one hand, noblewomen were expected to attend lavish banquets and engage in the social theatre of eating. On the other hand, they had to do it while squeezed into a corset so tight their internal organs were basically roommates. Meals were grand affairs. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacock, marzipan sculptures, and gilded fruit. But for upper-class women, actually eating was a delicate performance. You could nibble, you could sip, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a goose leg. That would have been barbaric and potentially dangerous given the bone in your bodice. Instead, you were expected to take dainty bites, keep your back straight, and smile through the growing pressure in your ribs. Sometimes the act of sitting upright for hours and pretending to enjoy cold eel pie was enough to trigger a fainting spell, which, frankly, only added to the aesthetic. Pale, breathless, and collapsing into the arms of a handsome courtier. Tip. Of course, this polite self-starvation had limits. Many noblewomen were secretly ravenous by the time they reached their private chambers, where they could finally remove the corset and devour a hidden stash of sweet meats or leftover cheese. Yes, even Renaissance beauty queens had midnight snacks, they just couldn't admit it. There were also rules for food. Cucumbers were discouraged because they made the skin watery. Wine was encouraged because it flushed the cheeks with colour. Some ladies even drank vinegar tonics to stay trim, because nothing says high fashion like ruining your gut lining. So while men got to recline, drink heavily, and argue about Dante, women mastered the art of elegant restraint, eating just enough to seem sociable, but never enough to ruin the line of their gown. And this obsession with form didn't stop at the ankle. In fairness, no one was really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty dictated that a woman's feet be kept decently hidden beneath layers of brocade and silk, which was a pity, considering how completely ridiculous Renaissance footwear often was. Let's start with the chopine, the most theatrical shoe ever invented. Chopines were essentially high-platform soles. Think ancient Roman sandals crossed with stilts. Originally Venice, they were designed to keep fine dresses above the muddy, plague-infested streets. But over time, function gave way to fashion, and chopines got taller. Much, much taller. Some were over 20 inches high. Yes, that's not a typo, 20 inches. Wearing them required balance, training, and frequently a servant on each arm. In Florence, chopines weren't quite as extreme, but the trend still trickled down. Wealthy women wore delicate, pointed slippers, often made of velvet, that were indoor shoes. Outdoors, you wore pattens, wooden or cork platforms strapped underneath your slippers to protect them from the street. A practical solution, unless you tripped and shattered your kneecaps on cobblestones. Foot binding wasn't a thing in Renaissance Italy, but the pressure to have dainty, narrow feet absolutely was. Shoes were pointed, narrow, and not built for actual walking. But who needed to walk when you could glide from sedan chair to palace hall, leaving a trail of crushed flower petals and broken arches? After hours of being powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, stuffed, and platformed, what came next? That's right, dancing. Because nothing completes the Renaissance beauty ritual like trying to glide across a polished marble floor in 20 pounds of fabric and 2 inches of breathable lung space. Courtly dancers were serious business. These weren't your carefree tavern-style reels. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, elegant, and excruciatingly choreographed. Every step was rehearsed, every movement symbolic. The wrong foot placement could imply social ineptitude. A misstep scandalous. You might as well shout, "I own nothing," in lapis lazuli and run barefoot into the Arno. For noblewomen, dancing was a test of composure. The most popular forms, like the pavane or the galliard, required gliding in precise patterns, keeping your gaze modest, and never, under any circumstance, breathing through your mouth. That was considered undignified, which is unfortunate because corsets did not allow for deep breaths. Every galliard leap was a calculated gamble against passing out cold, and yet it was crucial. A woman's grace on the dance floor was as vital to her reputation as her dowry. The goal was to radiate effortless control, even as your shoes blistered and your ribs whimpered. There was also the matter of social strategy. Dancing offered a rare opportunity to interact briefly with eligible men. Gloved hands touched for a moment, eyes met during a bow, perfumes mingled. It was flirtation with footnotes. But say too much, move too boldly, or, heaven forbid, laugh, and you risked ruining your entire aesthetic of pious elegance. Meanwhile, the background noise of every court event was a choir of judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, your posture. Servants whispered, tutors fretted, and all the while you had to maintain the illusion that none of it mattered. But it did. A clumsy turn or an off-rhythm curtsy could haunt you for weeks. So you danced, you smiled, you endured, and when the music finally stopped, you excused yourself to repowder your sweat-streaked ceruse before round 2. The guests had departed, the candles had melted into waxy puddles, and the Renaissance noblewoman, divine, dazzling, and delicately dying inside, finally made it back to her chambers. But sleep? Not yet. First came the Renaissance version of the night routine. Spoiler alert, it was less self-care and more controlled deterioration. Step 1, the unmasking. Out came the linen cloths, rose water, and raw egg whites. The lead-based ceruse had to be gently removed. Not because it was delicate, but because scrubbing too hard would take skin with it. Many women used a mix of almond oil and vinegar to lift the layers, hoping their complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged. Spoiler, it usually was. Then came the hair, or what was left of it. Carefully, the pins and fake braids were uncoiled. Any adhesive used to keep forehead wigs in place had to be dissolved with herbal tonics. Ladies hoped the cat dung and quicklime they used for hair removal earlier in the week hadn't left bald patches. No pressure. Next, the corset unlacing. A spiritual experience, one that usually involved gasping, groaning, and possibly an audible crunch as ribs regained their original shape. Women could finally breathe. Not deeply, but enough to sigh in relief and maybe whisper, "Never again," for the 100th time. The feet were peeled out of slippers, revealing the crushed remains of what used to be toes. If you were lucky, your servant brought a basin of warm water with lavender or rosemary to soak them. If not, you just stared at your feet and wondered if you'd ever feel joy again. Finally, you were rubbed down with sweet oils. Or, if you were particularly devout or paranoid, an alchemical tonic promising to preserve your youth. Never mind that it smelled like old copper and probably contained powdered beetles. Beauty is pain, and also possibly pestilence. And then, at last, the candle was blown out. Not with a huff, still too improper, but a delicate puff like you were apologizing to the flame. You lay back, hairline 2 inches farther back than it was last year, skin slightly more ghostly than the day before, lungs recovering from corset trauma. But tomorrow, you'd do it all again, because in Renaissance Florence, beauty wasn't just a look, it was a lifestyle, a full-time, high-stakes performance with no intermission. And the audience, everyone. For all the powdered faces and laced-up gowns, the Renaissance wasn't a safe haven for literary freedom, especially not when the Inquisition was watching. And in Italy it always was. By the mid-1500s, the Catholic Church had grown increasingly suspicious of books that could corrupt the soul, which in practice meant anything remotely entertaining. In 1559, Pope Paul IV issued the first official Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. It was exactly what it sounded like, a hit list of texts deemed too dangerous, heretical, or, God forbid, titillating. The list included everything from Protestant theology to astrology manuals. But buried among them were treatises on love, anatomy, and even poetry. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was banned. Boccaccio's Decameron was banned. Anything by Erasmus that even hinted at individual thought was double banned. The Church wasn't just trying to save souls, it was sanitizing the entire intellectual bloodstream. Possessing a forbidden book didn't just mean a slap on the wrist. If you were a printer, merchant, or noble caught with one, you risked public penance, house searches, confiscation, and even imprisonment. More than one scholar found himself summoned to explain why he had a Latin copy of The Art of Love tucked between Aristotle and Aquinas. But the funny thing about banning books is that it usually makes them more desirable. Underground markets thrived. Printers in Venice, Lyon, and Basel published clean editions for public sale and on-cut readers' editions for private clients. The difference might be a missing passage, a toned-down illustration, or a completely fake title page. One infamous copy of The Golden Ass was rebound as Sermons of St. Augustine. Talk about a plot twist. Noble families with private libraries developed entire systems for hiding forbidden text, secret compartments, false bindings, mirrored cabinets. A well-curated bookshelf said, "Yes, I fear God, but I also read Rabelais." Women were particularly clever about this, since they were less likely to be targeted as intellectual threats. They often acted as literary couriers, borrowing, copying, and circulating books under the pretense of devotional reading. One nun in Naples allegedly kept a copy of a translated Perfumed Garden behind her copy of Lives of the Saints. Censorship may have ruled publicly, but in private, Renaissance readers just turned the page more carefully, and behind convent walls, away from the judgmental eyes of society and the ever-looming index, some Renaissance nuns had access to their own libraries, and some of them were anything but holy. While convents were often seen as bastions of chastity and devotion, the truth was more complicated. These were also places of literacy, intellectual curiosity, and, yes, suppressed desire. Many young women entered religious life not by choice, but by family arrangement. Too expensive to marry off. Send her to the nuns. Too outspoken. Close to her. The result was a generation of women who were highly educated, forcibly celibate, and bored out of their minds. On the surface, these convent collections were pious and respectable saints' lives, theological commentaries, devotional poetry. But dig deeper, and you'd find marginalia scrawled in the corners, entire passages underlined with suspicious enthusiasm, and in some cases, handwritten copies of banned love poetry tucked discreetly between prayer books. One nun in Ferrara was famously reprimanded for translating Ovid's Amours into the vernacular, allegedly for educational purposes. Others wrote their own verses, coded, melancholic, and often steeped in longing. Scholars today suspect that some of the most passionate Renaissance sonnets attributed to anonymous courtly ladies were actually penned by cloistered women, using writing as a kind of romantic escape hatch. And it wasn't just poetry. Some convents had copies of anatomical treatises, ostensibly for medical knowledge, since nuns often acted as nurses. But as we've seen, anatomy books were rarely just about medicine. One abbess in Florence even petitioned to keep her convent's illustrated anatomy manual on the grounds that helps the younger sisters understand temptation. which is a very creative interpretation. Of course, not all forbidden books were kept in libraries or chained to monastery shelves. Some were hidden in aprons, buried under floorboards, or whispered from memory in back alley markets. These weren't printed by respected presses or debated in salons. These were the other Renaissance texts, the magical ones. Handwritten grimoires, herb manuals, and charm books passed between midwives, herbalists, and women who were definitely not calling themselves witches, but everyone else was. Love was power, and power, especially when exercised by a woman, was dangerous. That's why love spells were among the most feared and popular forms of forbidden knowledge. Renaissance charm books often included instructions on how to win affection, cause obsession, or rekindle a cold marriage. A strand of hair, a cup of wine, a muttered phrase beneath the full moon. It wasn't theology, it was folk science, and it worked, or at least it felt like it did. By the late Renaissance, the printing press had changed everything. Books were no longer handcrafted treasures for the elite. They were commodities. And while Gutenberg may have started with Bibles, it wasn't long before printers discovered a far more lucrative market desire. Venice became the capital of this quiet revolution. Hidden behind religious tracts and scholarly commentaries, small, privately circulated books began to appear. Books that weren't coy about their contents. They didn't pretend to be anatomy manuals. They didn't disguise poetry as devotion. These were explicit, illustrated, and ready to shock. One of the most infamous was I Modi, translated as The Positions. Originally created by engraver Marcantonio Raimondi, it depicted 16 scenes of explicit intimacy. Each engraving was paired with poetic verses by Pietro Aretino, whose sharp wit and even sharper tongue earned him a reputation as the Renaissance's first pornographer. Needless to say, the church was not amused. I Modi was immediately banned, plates were seized, and copies were destroyed. But the idea that you could use the printing press for erotica had been unleashed, and it wasn't going back in the bottle. Underground presses sprang up across Europe, printing slim volumes of love poetry, scandalous tales, and sometimes outright smut. These weren't mass-produced. Copies were expensive, meant for wealthy patrons with a taste for the forbidden. Some were even commissioned privately with content tailored to the buyer's fantasy. Think of it as custom Renaissance fanfiction. Printers developed clever tricks to avoid detection, like fake title pages, false publishing locations, or Latin phrases that made the books look like harmless philosophy. In reality, they were often illustrated with woodcuts or copper engravings that made anatomy textbooks look tame. For the right price, you could have a book that thrilled, amused, or shocked without ever admitting you owned it. Many nobles kept theirs in cabinets with special keys. The printing press didn't just democratize knowledge, it made lust portable. And with every new title, Renaissance readers got one step closer to something revolutionary: pleasure without permission. By the end of the Renaissance, the line between education, entertainment, and seduction had blurred beyond recognition. What began as anatomical curiosity or theological instruction had transformed into a secret bookshelf of longing, one that crossed gender, class, and even religious boundaries. And that's precisely what made it so dangerous. To the church, these books represented moral decay. To scholars, they were intellectual experiments. But to the people actually reading them, noble women, students, nuns, even merchants, they were something else entirely: power. Not the kind won on a battlefield or in a courtroom, but the quieter, more subversive kind that starts in the margins of a book. In an age where women's bodies were controlled, their voices silenced, and their desires shamed, these books offered an alternative script, a place where love wasn't always arranged, where pleasure could be named, and where curiosity didn't have to be confessed in Latin. For all the public bravado and church-sponsored guilt, men were buying these books too. Philosophers who debated virtue by day might go home and rid the golden ass with a glass of wine. Priests who condemned lust from the pulpit sometimes kept a copy of Ovid tucked beneath their cassock. Human nature, after all, has always been good at compartmentalizing. The forbidden bookshelf wasn't just a Renaissance quirk, it was a reflection of a world wrestling with change. The printing press had opened Pandora's box. Literacy was spreading. Ideas were getting harder to control, and once people realized that books could make them feel something deeply, privately, even sinfully, there was no going back. Most of these books didn't survive intact. They were burned, hidden, or miscatalogued. But some did. They sit today in museum vaults and rare book rooms, fragile and foxed with age, still humming with the echoes of secrets whispered across centuries. Because the Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art and science, it was a rebirth of desire. And in between the sermons and sculptures, the forbidden books tell us everything the marble couldn't. And that brings us to our final destination, a culture that took a different approach to social rebellion and personal expression. We've talked about what people wore on their skin, but what about what they put under it? Before it became linked to crime syndicates and back alley parlors, tattoos in Japan carried a far more complex and layered identity, one deeply rooted in honor, mythology, and labor. Long before the Edo period, Japanese tattoos were used as punitive marks, burned or etched into criminals' faces and arms to permanently brand them as outcasts. But by the 1600s, these crude symbols had evolved into something far more intricate, something closer to art devotion and even spiritual armor. In Edo, Japan, society was rigidly structured. Class divisions were clear. Samurai had swords, merchants had rules. Everyone else, they had restrictions. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced strict codes on dress and behavior, especially for the lower classes. Ornate robes, luxurious fabrics, and flashy jewelry were reserved for the elite. But human nature always finds a loophole. If you couldn't wear brocade on the outside, why not wear it on your skin? And so, full-body tattoos flourished underground, hidden beneath plain work clothes, but revealed in bathhouses, festivals, and moments of intimacy. These weren't random designs, they were stories. Sleeves of swirling dragons, bodysuits of phoenixes, koi fish, cherry blossoms, Buddhist deities, and folkloric heroes. Each tattoo carried meaning. A koi swimming upstream symbolized perseverance. A dragon on the back meant power and protection. These motifs weren't chosen on a whim. They were earned, sometimes one painful inch at a time. And the process was brutal. There were no machines, no antiseptic creams. Artists, called harishi, used wooden handles and steel needles to hand-poke ink beneath the skin. The ink, often mixed with charcoal or natural pigments, was hammered in using rhythmic strikes. Sessions lasted hours. Full bodysuits could take years. But the result was a living mural that turned skin into storytelling. Yet, despite their cultural richness, tattoos remained illegal for much of the Edo period. Authorities viewed them as signs of disorder, deviance, or wastefulness, and so the art of Irezumi thrived in the shadows, respected by some, feared by others, and completely invisible to the ruling elite. In Edo period Japan, where wooden buildings were packed like kindling and open flames lit every lantern, fires were constant and devastating. The samurai might have ruled the land, but when your neighborhood caught fire, it was the fireman, the kyphi, who saved your life. These weren't firemen as we imagine today. They didn't use hoses or wear flame-retardant suits. Instead, they carried hooks, axes, and raw courage. Their job wasn't to extinguish fires. It was to tear down nearby structures and create fire breaks before the flames could spread. This meant climbing onto burning rooftops and dismantling homes by hand, often while embers rained from the sky. Naturally, these men developed a culture of bravado, toughness, and brotherhood, and central to that culture was tattooing. Full-body tattoos became a badge of honor among the kyphi. Not only were they stunning displays of strength and endurance, they were deeply symbolic. Dragons for power, tigers for courage, gods and demons for spiritual protection. When a fireman stripped off his uniform to reveal a full suit of swirling ink, it wasn't vanity, it was armor. And the pain, it was part of the point. Sitting for hundreds of hours while needles punctured the skin was a rite of passage. If you could endure that, you could face down an inferno. The tattoos weren't just decoration. They were proof of fearlessness, commitment, and pain endured for the good of the group. Some crews even shared themes with all members sporting similar motifs to reflect unity. You'd see entire teams marked with identical dragons across their backs or coordinated waves and blossoms swirling down their arms. This wasn't gang behavior, it was solidarity. Brotherhood forged through smoke and fire, but it wasn't legal. Tattoos were still frowned upon by the authorities, seen as vulgar or wasteful, especially for public servants. So, the kyphi wore their ink beneath their clothes, only revealed in private bathhouses or celebratory festivals, where their role as local heroes gave them a pass, at least temporarily. Beyond the fire brigades and labor crews, another group embraced the painful elegance of Irizumi, the gamblers, rogues and thrill-seekers of Edo's underground. These were the drifters of the ukiyo, the floating world, a term that described both the pleasure quarters and the transient nature of existence itself. And in that fleeting world, tattoos were a language of risk, identity, and rebellion. Many of these men were bakuto, professional gamblers who roamed the country with dice, cards, and an uncanny ability to separate samurai from their stipends. While the bakuto had no formal organization at first, they lived by their own codes of loyalty, honor, and toughness. In a society that relegated them to the fringes, tattoos became a way to reclaim dignity, to turn a marginal life into one of meaning, one needle prick at a time. Their tattoos were bold, provocative, and unapologetically visible in the right settings. Peonies, fierce warriors, gods of fortune, and snakes slithered across their torsos. These weren't the quiet, contemplative inkings of monks or the civic pride of firemen. These were power statements, visual declarations that said, "I don't follow your rules. I live by my own." Many designs referenced famous characters from Japanese folklore and kabuki theater. Heroes like Sakata Kintoki, the Golden Boy, or mythical rebels who challenged authority. The more outrageous the figure, the more admired the tattoo. It wasn't just skin-deep symbolism. It was branding in a society where no one handed you a name unless you fought for it. And yet, despite their outsider status, these men were crucial to the underground economy. Their tattoos became both a badge and a warning: loyalty within, danger without. Though tattooing in Edo, Japan is often portrayed as a masculine tradition, women also left their mark, sometimes quite literally, on this hidden world of ink. While rarely documented in official records, female tattoos existed quietly, tenderly, and rebelliously beneath the layers of silk and propriety. In many cases, these tattoos were intimate, romantic, and personal. Unlike the large mythological bodysuits of their male counterparts, women's tattoos were often smaller, discreet, and emotionally charged. Lovers would tattoo each other's names on hidden parts of their bodies, inside the upper arm, on the inner thigh, near the collarbone. A gesture known as Irizumi Chibun, or love tattoos. A popular phrase inked onto women's skin was Ininoyazukosu, meaning, "I entrust you with my life." It was more than a vow. It was a declaration of emotional surrender written in pain. This kind of tattooing was especially common among lovers in the ukiyo, the floating world of pleasure districts where courtesans and geisha reign. Among high-ranking courtesans, tattoos were sometimes a tool of seduction. A small, teasing mark, visible only when a robe slipped just right, became part of the mystique. It gave the illusion of intimacy, as if a client was seeing something forbidden. In reality, the tattoo may have been shared with dozens of clients, each believing it was a private secret. In other cases, tattoos signified heartbreak or betrayal. A courtesan might burn or slash a name tattooed on her body after a lover abandoned her, turning passion into scarred testimony. Some even covered these names with new ink, dragons swallowing letters, waves washing away memories. But for women outside the pleasure quarters, tattoos could also be acts of quiet rebellion. Peasant women, fisherwomen, or wives of tattooed men sometimes followed suit, inspired by the artistry or solidarity. Though they risked judgment, these women wore their ink privately under their robes as silent declarations of autonomy. While Edo society officially condemned such markings, especially on women, These tattoos carved out a hidden narrative, one of love, agency, and pain born, a story the official histories never bothered to write down. Behind every breathtaking bodysuit, every swirling dragon and tragic hero etched in flesh, there stood the unsung artisans of Edo, Japan, the horishi, or tattoo masters. They worked quietly in tucked-away corners of the city, in anonymous rooms above tea houses, in the back rooms of barber shops, or in candlelit apartments that smelled of incense and ink. There were no flashing signs, no customer reviews, just a reputation that was passed by word of mouth and, of course, on inked skin. Becoming a horishi was no casual decision. It took years of training, usually through an apprenticeship under a master. The tools were basic wooden handles with clusters of steel needles at the tip, which were dipped into a thick black ink called sumi, made from soot and animal glue. The technique itself was painstakingly slow and deeply, deeply painful. The needles were jabbered rhythmically into the skin by hand, often with a bamboo mallet. This process, called tebari, required steady hands, infinite patience, and the mental endurance of a monk. A single outline could take hours. A full bodysuit might require years of regular sessions, each one lasting half a day or more. And here's a wild detail. While most people would assume this hand-poked method was excruciating, many enthusiasts today argue that tebari is actually less painful than a modern tattoo machine. The reason? The tebari artist has a level of control that a machine simply can't replicate. The needles cause less bleeding and less trauma to the skin, which means less scabbing and a much faster healing time. So, while the process was slow and repetitive, the rhythmic tapping, and the controlled sting of each puncture was, to some, a more bearable pain. It was a pain that was precise and deliberate, not a random buzz-saw of a machine. But regardless of which method you think is more painful, the Edo Japanese didn't see the pain as a drawback. It was the entire point. Tattoos weren't something you just got, they were something you earned. The endurance it took to sit through these sessions became a badge of honor, often discussed with quiet pride in bathhouses and taverns. The pain was more than physical, it was symbolic. It separated the dilettantes from the devoted, a test of will, patience, and mental control. For some, it was a punishment. For others, purification. There was a spiritual dimension to it as well. Enduring pain was seen as a kind of self-discipline, similar to fasting or meditation. With each completed session, a person didn't just come closer to finishing a tattoo. They came closer to a transformation, and there were rules. You couldn't flinch. You couldn't cry out. Moving too much could ruin the design, or earn you a scolding from the horishi. But horishi weren't just craftsmen. They were storytellers, historians, and even psychologists. A good tattoo master had to understand not only how to tattoo, but what to tattoo. Every design carried meaning. The client might bring a request, but the horishi would decide the placement, the balance, and the very soul of the piece. For instance, a tiger climbing upward might mean ambition, but downward could suggest a warning. The tattoo wasn't just a picture, it was a map of a person's life journey. Clients would return over and over, sometimes for years, to complete their full suit. A bodyscape that stretched from shoulder to thigh, across the back, down the arms, and often stopping just above the wrist and neckline. This wasn't random. Tattoos had to remain hidden beneath daily clothing to avoid trouble with the authorities. Some horishi even signed their work not visibly, but secretly within the folds of a dragon's tail or hidden in the petals of a lotus. These subtle signatures became a badge of pride, recognizable only to those in the know. Despite the intimacy of their work, horishi lived with one foot outside of society. Their clientele were often firemen, gamblers, courtesans, people who existed on the fringes of the strict social hierarchy. So the artists, too, lived on the edge, revered by the underground but invisible to the powerful. In a world where the elite wore silk and status, the tattooed wore pain and permanence. Every line, every shade, every drop of color came at a price, measured in hours of moleless endurance and days of aching flesh. For the tattooed in Edo, Japan, the body became a canvas of personal folklore. Irizumi wasn't just something you wore, it was something you survived. It was an identity carved in pain, proudly worn in a world that had no place for them. Every inch of an Edo tattoo told a story. These weren't random designs picked from a menu, they were mythologies mapped onto the body. Carefully chosen symbols, each one with layered meanings encoded in swirling ink that stretched from shoulder to ankle. For the tattooed in Edo, Japan, the body became a canvas of personal folklore. Take the koi fish, for example. It wasn't just decorative, but way swimming upstream represented strength, determination, and the willingness to face impossible odds. This symbolism comes from a famous Chinese legend. The story says that a great school of koi were swimming up the Yellow River, pushing against the current. Most of the koi gave up and turned back, but a few persevered. They swam through rapids and climbed waterfalls until they reached a legendary waterfall known as the Dragon's Gate. According to the legend, a koi that reached the top of that waterfall would become a magnificent dragon. It was the perfect metaphor for a man trying to climb his way out of the lower classes, to prove something the world refused to see. The tattoo wasn't just a picture, it was a promise. It was a visual declaration that despite the current, they were going to keep swimming. And when they made it to the top, they became dragons. Dragons were everywhere in Edo tattoos, but they weren't the fire-breathing monsters of Western myth. In Japanese folklore, dragons are powerful, wise, and deeply tied to the forces of nature, often bringing rain and good fortune. A dragon coiling across the back wasn't meant to intimidate, it was meant to shield. A constant unseen presence between your skin and the world, a spiritual guardian. The symbolism went even deeper, with every animal, plant, and figure having a specific meaning. Peonies symbolized bravery with a touch of elegance. Tigers stood for ferocity and resolve. Snakes slithered across torsos, representing wisdom and protection, but also a hidden, dangerous side. The tattoos were a form of storytelling, and the stories they told were often deeply personal. Even the placement mattered. A tiger climbing upward might mean ambition, but downward could suggest a warning. Many tattoos depicted full scenes from Chinese and Japanese folklore, with battles, betrayals, and divine interventions. One of the most popular subjects was the Suikoden, a Chinese epic about 108 outlaw heroes. These stories resonated deeply with the tattooed class. They were about rebels, protectors, and misfits who didn't quite fit into the samurai ideal, but still lived by a powerful code. Having a hero from the Suikoden tattooed on your back was like wearing your values on your skin. It was a way of saying, I am a part of this lineage of honorable outlaws. Buddhist deities were common too, particularly the wrathful ones. Figures like Fudomayu, the movable protector. With a sword in one hand and a rope in the other, he bound demons and cut through ignorance. Having him tattooed on your back was like carrying a spiritual bodyguard, one who didn't mind getting violent when necessary. It was a visual reminder of the spiritual strength you needed to get through a dangerous and unpredictable life. But not all meanings were universal. A tattoo's placement, size, and direction all mattered. Even the order of when each section was tattooed said something about your journey. These symbols were sacred, private, and powerful. And in a society where words could betray you, tattoos became the most honest form of expression. They were a way to tell your story, to wear your beliefs, and to carry your spirit in a world that often refused to see it. As the Edo period progressed, this vibrant underground culture of Irizumi began to collide head-on with shifting social attitudes. What was once admired among hidden firemen and gamblers slowly became associated with crime, deviance, and dishonor, especially as it became more visible among the bakuto or gamblers who would give rise to the modern yakuza. The turning point came as the government began tightening its grip on public behavior. Tattooing, already unofficially frowned upon, started to take on a more dangerous reputation. The bakuto, with their lack of official standing, were often the only ones bold enough to wear full bodysuits openly, and as their groups became more organized, so did the stigma attached to their ink. This was a tragic irony. as many of these men had begun as outcasts from society who wore tattoos not to provoke fear, but to reclaim an identity they had been denied. But once crime syndicates began using tattoos to mark membership, territory, and loyalty, public perception shifted dramatically. The police didn't care whether your dragon symbolized courage or your koi fish meant perseverance. To them, tattoos now signaled one thing: criminality. The government responded with more bans. In the early 1800s, tattooing was officially outlawed, though enforcement varied depending on the region. Still, tattoo parlors went deeper underground. Horishi had to work in secret, and clients booked sessions through coded language. The stigma wasn't just legal, it was social. Anyone visibly tattooed could be refused entry into public bathhouses, barred from temples, or denied marriage by respectable families. Tattooed bodies became taboo, and the art form, once a mark of bravery or spiritual symbolism, was recast as something vulgar, dangerous, even evil. But the tattoos didn't disappear. They simply went deeper, both under the skin and under the radar. For every government crackdown, there was a new design, a new hiding spot, a new client willing to endure the pain for something meaningful. Irizumi didn't die. It went into hiding like a coiled dragon waiting. As Japan stepped into the modern age with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the new government was eager to present the country as civilized, orderly, and most importantly, westernized. And in this new image of modern Japan, tattoos had no place. Irizumi, with all its cultural depth and underground prestige, was declared a stain. The government doubled down. Tattooing was not only criminal, it was now embarrassing, something savage, something shameful. Foreign diplomats were horrified by the elaborate bodysuits worn by Edo's working class, and Japan, desperate to be taken seriously by the West, responded by pushing tattooing deeper underground than ever before. Yet, even as it was banned for Japanese citizens, tattooing curiously became a tourist attraction. British and American sailors flocked to Japanese ports and sought out Horishi to take home pieces of exotic oriental body art. Ironically, the very art form Japan sought to bury was being preserved by the very foreigners whose approval they craved. And still, the tradition didn't die. Horishi adapted. They changed their clientele, moved their studios further into secrecy, and kept the tebari method alive. Master-apprentice lineages survived in whispers. The techniques, symbolism, and tools were passed down carefully, often within families or tightly knit artistic circles. In the 20th century, Irizumi became deeply entangled with the Yakuza. The full bodysuit, hidden beneath business suits, became a symbol of loyalty and fear within the criminal underworld. Once again, tattoos were about pain, honor, and secrecy, but this time without the folkloric grace of Edo firemen or mythological koi. The art was still there, but the public had turned away. Even today, the legacy of that stigma lingers. Despite modern interest in tattoo culture worldwide, Japan still views tattoos with suspicion. Public baths, gyms, and even some beaches ban tattooed individuals. The fear of criminal association endures even when the ink is harmless. But times are shifting. Young Japanese artists are reclaiming Irizumi not as rebellion, but as heritage. Museums are preserving ancient designs. Art lovers and historians are finally acknowledging the craftsmanship, and a new generation is asking, why should we be ashamed of our own skin? In a culture built on layers, of robes, of meaning, of silence, Irizumi remains the most honest expression Japan ever tried to hide.